want to start out this morning by sharing a struggle that my wife and I seem to have every Friday night, and that struggle is to pick which movie we're going to watch. And whether you're single or married, you know that this is a deep, deep struggle. And I don't know what it is about Netflix and what it is about Amazon Prime or HBO or Disney. Like, it feels like they have hundreds of movies. None of them are good. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that. They have hundreds of movies. None of them are good. And so you're scrolling through all these movies, trying to find one that you like. Like, I even go to the A through Z. I'm going to go A through Z. I'm going to look through all these movies. And then you think of one that you like, and you're like, oh, I think someone said that this was a good movie, and you type it in. Turns out you have to pay for that one, right? That one's behind the firewall. Like, you need to pay Apple money in order to watch that movie, right? Because this is what I think Apple does. I think Apple knows all the good movies. Like, they know the good movies, right? And they take all those movies and they put them behind their paywall. So yes, you are paying $7.99 or whatever for Netflix every month, but you never watch any of those movies. You're paying $4.99 to watch the movie that you actually want to rent that month, right? And so Sarah and I, we have trouble finding movies. And even more so, if there's a Venn diagram of the movies that I like and the movies that she likes, man, there's a real small sliver right there in the middle. And, I like spy movies and a certain kind of spy movie. Like, it cannot be historically accurate at all. If it's historically accurate, I just can't watch it. And it's got to be over the top. So James Bond, Jack Reacher, Mission Impossible, these are like my kinds of movies, right? Sarah, on the other hand, loves historically accurate World War II dramas. I would say that's probably her favorite kind of movie. The more talking, the better. The less actual war part, the better. This is the kind of movie that she likes. So you can see we kind of struggle to find movies, but there is a sliver. A sliver, I don't even know who that is. So she likes a sliver of hope. And the sliver of our intersectionality is one thing: 90s rom-coms, 90s romantic comedies. True story. Blast from the Past, 10 Things I Hate About You, Groundhog's Day. We can watch these movies all day long. So the other night, we found a movie that was actually available on Netflix and that we both wanted to watch, and that movie was Sleepless in Seattle. Has anyone seen this movie? Raise your hand if you've seen Sleepless in Seattle. All right, we got to put people who like this movie. Sleepless in Seattle has all the elements of a great 90s movie. You got Tom Hanks, right? I like to say you can't go wrong with Tom. Always going to be a good movie. You got Meg Ryan, good other lead of the 90s, kind of female lead. They were in a movie together, so you think, okay, it's going to be a good movie. You got the 90s snarky kid in the movie. If you've seen the movie before, every 90s movie has like a snarky kid who's like wiser beyond his years, and he always cracks jokes at the tense moments to remind you, this is a rom-com, it's not too serious, right? So he's going to go in there and give you just the little one-liners that remind you you're watching a comedy. It also has an interesting plot. If you know anything about the movie, Tom plays a guy who loses his wife, and so he's a widower. He moves to Seattle with his son, and about a year passes, and he's still kind of depressed, and so the son is like, you know what, I got to do something. So he calls into a radio show, and he tells the nation about his dad and what he's going through. And I guess every single woman in the nation listens to this radio show because he starts to get thousands and thousands of letters from women all around the country saying, hey, I heard your story, let's date, here's my number. That's like the premise of the movie, right? And so that's kind of how he gets connected to Meg Ryan, the female lead of the movie. But here's my beef with this movie. I think the movie kind of ends a bit too soon, and I think you know what I'm talking about. You ever watched a movie, and you're kind of going through, and maybe you check like the scroll, how much is left in the movie, and you're like, wait a second, there's not enough left here to really do the ending justice, right? There's only like 5 more minutes. Like, wait a second, they haven't done this thing that I expected them to do. They haven't connected at the level that I expected them to connect. And so I'm watching this movie, and it's like the classic thing where all of a sudden they kind of like meet at the end, and you hear a swell of strings. I'm like, oh no, don't you dare. Hans Zimmer, I'm not ready for you yet, right? So you hear the swell of strings. And then all of a sudden the camera starts panning out a little bit. And you're like, no, don't do that. And then all of a sudden pans up to the sky, credits roll, right? And I'm like, man, this movie ended way too soon. If you haven't seen the movie, go watch it. It's pretty good. Terrible ending, though, in my personal opinion. Endings matter, right? A bad ending of a book can ruin the book, right? Bad ending of a movie can ruin a movie. The end is the most important part. It's where the most important thing gets said. It's where the theme is reinforced. It's where the truth is said. It's what leaves us. That feeling is what we leave with. So an ending is important. Today we are at the end of the book of Mark. It's been an incredible story. Man, it's been a story of Jesus healing people. It's been a story of Jesus being pronounced as the Son of God. It's been a story of Jesus walking on water, calming storms, doing all kinds of stuff. It has been an incredible story. And as we come up to the end of the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 16, it ends kind of weird, if we're honest. And actually, as I studied this book, I kind of never realized that this is the way that it ends until I prepped for this sermon. And so I want you to open up there with me, and I want you to see how the incredible story of the Gospel of Mark ends in Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Look at verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. That is the dead body of Jesus. He has been crucified at this point, and so they're going to the tomb to anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had already been rolled back, and it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Amen. This is God's word over us. That's how the book of Mark ends. The last sentence in the book of Mark says, they fled the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So literally the book of Mark ends with the phrase, they were afraid. Talk about kind of like a cliffhanger, right? An interesting ending to the story. I've entitled my sermon this morning, Resurrection Reactions. And the reason I called my sermon that is that when you look at this passage, it's very much about these three women and their reaction, their response to encountering the resurrection of Jesus. Mark chapter 16 is a deeply divine story. You have deeply divine truths in this story. Death to life, the tomb to the empty grave, defeat to victory. These are very divine themes, and they mark the biblical testimony and the gospel testimony of Jesus' life. So it's a very divine story, but it's also a very human story. It deals with how these women grapple with the resurrection of Jesus, what it means for them. It creates almost like a crisis of faith in their life, an existential crisis for what it means to know and relate to Jesus. And I also think it calls us to grapple with how do we respond to the resurrection. And it doesn't matter if the resurrection was 2,000 years ago or whether it was this morning. We all stand at the empty tomb asking ourselves, how are we going to respond to the resurrection of Jesus? The book ends so bizarre. It's like an open-ended story. Will they go tell the disciples? Are they going to obey? What happens to them? This is where Mark ends. Now, some of you, if you're very astute and you got your Bible open, you may notice that there's actually kind of more to the story at the end. You'll notice that maybe there's a footnote in your Bible, or notice maybe there's some brackets kind of bracketed off at the end of verse 8, and you'll be like, well, actually, James, there's more to the story. Well, if you study a little bit, and if you know anything about what we call textual criticism, then you'll know that this actual verses 9 through 20 were actually added a little bit later, that these weren't a part of the original work that Mark wrote in the early days after Jesus' life, and that over time, probably in the second century church, they wanted to kind of add to the story because it felt like it was kind of cut off. And so over time, scribes kind of added these different verses, and you can kind of tell where they brought it from. A lot of the verses in 9 through 20 actually come from Matthew, and they come from Luke, they come from John. And so Mark was the earliest gospel to be written. And so you can see how people over time have kind of added, right? They're like us. We don't like a cliffhanger. We don't like to be left dangling. They didn't like the end of Mark. The women fleeing, running in terror, astonished at what they had seen, telling no one, for they were afraid. It's an uncomfortable ending to the book. And so over time, people have tried to wrap it up in a nice little bow. Mark's ending is also kind of problematic because who's missing from the story? Just shout out, who's missing from the story? Jesus, right? Jesus ain't in the story. This whole gospel is about Jesus, and all of a sudden Jesus isn't here. He's in every other chapter of Mark, but you don't see him here in the last chapter of Mark. And then, of course, it ends so abruptly. This morning, what I want to do, instead of giving us like tidy conclusions, theological conclusions about the resurrection, what I want us to do is I want us to get into the shoes of these women and experience what they experienced and see how that relates to our life as we stand at the edge of the resurrection, on the other side of the resurrection of Jesus. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start there, and we're going to see what comes out of this ending. Why does Mark leave us at a cliffhanger, and what does it mean for our life this morning? So let's start in verse 1. It says, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on, in the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. So let's stop right there. So you got three women. And I love that this chapter is about these women because these are very faithful women. It's awesome to do a study on women of the Bible because they're often very faithful, sometimes even more faithful than their male counterparts. And so here you have Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene is a woman whose life was very dysfunctional. The book of Matthew says that Jesus drove out demons from her, so you can tell she was having a very rough life, maybe made choices in her life that weren't aligned to the will of God for her, and so she's a wreck, she's dysfunctional. And then she meets Jesus, and all of a sudden her entire trajectory changes, and she becomes a follower of Jesus. I love Mary Magdalene because she was there for all of the events around the crucifixion. She heard Pilate pronounce judgment on Jesus. She was there. She saw them beat and mock and humiliate Jesus. She was there. She even stood near to Jesus in his crucifixion to try to comfort him. She was there. Mary Magdalene is presented as a very faithful and devoted woman. Then there's Mary, the mother of James. We don't know very much about her, but we know that she was the mother of one of the disciples. She was also present at Jesus' crucifixion. And then there's Salome. We don't know very much about her, but she was probably the mother of the disciples James and John. And if so, she was the woman who asked Jesus if her sons could sit at the left and right hand of Jesus when he came into his kingdom. And so obviously she got kind of rebuked for that, but she's still presented as a faithful woman. She was there also at the crucifixion. And what I love about these women is they respond to the events that were happening to them is that they were dealing with their own grief, but they were still devoted to Jesus. Look at what they do. They bought spices to anoint Jesus. So imagine Jesus dies late Friday afternoon, and the Sabbath is coming up. The Sabbath is 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday. The Sabbath is coming up, and so Jesus' body is taking down, and so Jesus' body wasn't anointed per their custom, and so these women see that, and they're like, man, there's unfinished business, and so they wait until the Sabbath ends, and then they run out to buy these spices so that they could anoint Jesus' body. They rose very early in the morning, earlier than even the sun coming up. They rose early in the morning and they rushed out. And then they went to the tomb of a man who was executed as a traitor of the Roman government. No one likes to be associated with the guy that was canceled, right? They go. I got a question. Where are the disciples? In a room, right? Locked up in a room. It's these three women who go to take care of business. They are devoted to Jesus. I wonder, what does it look like to be devoted to Jesus in a time in which it is not popular to do so? What does devotion look like? A lot of times we talk about devotion in terms of what we do for Jesus, but what about standing with Jesus in his darkest hour? These women are experiencing all the things that we experience in life. They were disappointed. They were stricken with grief. They were sad. Let me tell you, man, there's nothing more disappointing than going to anoint the dead body of Jesus, this man that you put all your hopes on, all your dreams on, all your devotion on. And yet they go. I wonder, do we stand with Jesus in our disappointment? Is your disappointment an opportunity for you to pull away from Jesus, to go be where the disciples are? They were disappointed too, and they're not at the tomb. They're up in a room by themselves. They pulled away. But these women draw near. They use their disappointment to draw near to Jesus. Here's the thing. You will never experience what it's like to be on your way to anoint the dead body of Jesus, because we know that Jesus is alive. And so if Jesus is alive, it means that he can handle any disappointment that stands in front of us in our life. How do you stand with Jesus in your disappointment and in your grief? You know, even this past week, I went to the funeral of the father of a man in our church, and I just love seeing this man talk about his father. And you could tell, I mean, he's weeping and he's overcome with grief, and yet he's pointing to the hope that he has in Jesus and in the resurrection in that hour. And I was so moved by that moment, that in this moment of grief, in this dark hour in this man's life, he draws near to Jesus. He brings his disappointment to Jesus, not away from him. How are we devoted to Jesus? And what do we do with our disappointment in those moments of grief? These are opportunities to draw near, not to draw away from Jesus. Look at verse 3. It says, "And they were saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?' And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back, and it was very large." So these women are very devoted, but let's be honest, they did not expect to find Jesus resurrected, did they? They expected to find the dead body of Jesus. They were on their way to anoint a dead body. They clearly expected to find the stone in place. They clearly expected to find a dead body inside, because they're asking themselves, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? So as devoted as these women were, they obviously were not taking Jesus at his word. Jesus told them that he was going to be resurrected, that he was going to suffer, that he was going to die, and on the third day he was going to rise again. And in fact, in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus says, "But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." And so you see these women, they're going to the wrong place because they're not trusting Jesus' word. They're on their way to the tomb, and Jesus ain't even there. Jesus is in Galilee at work. I love how after all Jesus has done, walked on water, healed the sick, cast out demons, even Mary has demon cast out of her. I would say that's a very existential moment in your life. Their biggest concern after all that was, how are we going to move this rock? I love how we're focused so much in our life on the rock. Terrified of the rock, stumped by the rock. We're like, God, this rock is so big, I can't even move it. And God's like, it's just a rock. It's just a rock. I can move that easily. It's just a rock. It's just a marriage issue. It's just a bad week. It's just a money issue. The God who made the mountains can move a rock. And I wonder for us, do we join them in their unbelief in our own life? We have the scriptures. We have way more knowledge than they do about Jesus and his resurrection. But I wonder for us, in light of the resurrection, are we stumped by the rock? The issues, problems in our life. We're so focused on the rock that we miss the miracle. I'll tell you where we don't find Jesus. We do not find Jesus in our unbelief. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 says, "And without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." So you find Jesus not in the moments of unbelief, but in the moments of faith, of belief, of trusting that I'm going to go and the tomb is going to be empty. Or even better, I'm going to go to Galilee because I know that's where I'm going to find Jesus. I was thinking the other day how unbelief, when we don't believe Jesus, when we don't believe what he says, it creates an anxiety in your life that is completely avoidable. Jesus says, do not be anxious, and therefore anxiety is avoidable. This whole scene where they're going to anoint this dead body, this whole moment of grief, this darkest hour of theirs, they never should have gone through this. Because they should have believed Jesus at his word, and they shouldn't have gone to the tomb. They should have gone right on to Galilee saying, we'll wait for him there because we know that's where he's going to be. Sometimes in our life, it feels like the rock is so large that it cannot be moved. And sometimes it takes these moments where we realize God can do whatever he wants. And I've shared this story before, but it was so meaningful in my life. There was a moment where I was struggling with rent and paying bills because I didn't have a full-time job at the time. And I remember sharing, just spending so many weeks in anxiety over this moment. And I went to my parents' house one day and I was just kind of talking, and I finally kind of, not broke down, but I kind of tearing up, just kind of sharing my state. And I remember, we talked about that, and, they kind of prayed with me. And as I'm leaving, my dad kind of runs out and he's gives me an envelope, and he's like, here, I just wanted to take care of you. And I wonder how many of us, if an earthly man could do that for me, how much more so could the Heavenly Father do that for us in our life? Jesus said that his promises are as good as gold, that we can believe his promises. And when we don't believe his promises, we invite unnecessary anxiety and grief in our life. Jesus promised them that he was going to rise from the dead, but they missed it. They were so worried about the tomb, they thought they were going to find the dead body of Jesus. And instead, they find something very different. Look at verse 5. It says, "And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed." I would be alarmed. You would be alarmed. You know how you watch movies, scary movies, and they do stupid stuff, and you're like, I would never do that because I'm a smart person. You would do that as well, I think. And so in this moment, I'm reminded that I would probably be alarmed if I saw a tomb and there's a man sitting there in dazzling white, right? Look at verse 6. "And he said to them, 'Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they have laid him.'" Put yourself in their shoes. You're on your way. You're carrying a satchel of spices to anoint the dead body of your friend who was executed by the Roman government. And you're worried about this tomb, or this rock of the tomb, and you walk up, and the rock is rolled away. And so you run inside, and there's a man sitting there, dressed in dazzling white. And he tells you, Jesus isn't here, he's risen. See, look, there's an empty spot in the tomb where he was. I would be freaked out. I don't know about you, I would be freaked out in that moment. And the angel says, he's risen, he is not here. And this moment puts them into a paralysis. It jolts them. They are shocked in this moment by what they are seeing. It's almost like they cannot process what is happening because they didn't believe Jesus when he said that he was going to rise from the dead. And so they are shocked. And the angel says, "Look, see the place where he's laid." Basically said, consider the evidence. Jesus is not here. What I love about this story is because in this particular story, the women don't get to meet Jesus face to face. Now, we know ultimately they do because we look at other gospel accounts. But in this story, they actually don't get to see Jesus. They only hear the testimony of someone else saying that he is risen. And I find that really cool for us in our day because we don't get to see Jesus physically. We have to take the word of the testimony of these witnesses and the testimony of the angel. This is all that Mark gives us. And for Mark, the empty tomb and the angel telling them Jesus is risen is enough. They don't need more evidence than that. And so for every one of us, as we stand at the other side of the resurrection, we must answer for ourselves. Do I believe that he is risen? If you're unsure, I would call you to do what the angel calls them to do. Take a look. Consider the evidence. Consider the eyewitness testimonies of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Consider the absurdity of an ancient writer using women as witnesses for an important event. That just wasn't done. You wouldn't write in female characters to talk about an important event. That just wasn't what the time period was like. And so here you have these three women as the first women, the testimony, the witnesses to the resurrection. Nobody would make that up or fabricate that and put that in their story back in first century Jerusalem. Consider the details within the resurrection story. You know, a lot of people say the resurrection of Jesus is like mythology, right? It's just a hopeful kind of story. It's not real. It's not written like mythology. Look at this story. Look at all the different details in this story. It has references to time. It says Sabbath and first day of the week. It has references to women, Mary, Mary, and Salome. And if you're making up a story, you don't make up a name twice, Mary, Mary. That's just, you wouldn't do that, right? It's not smart. You have the angel sitting on the right side. Why is it important he's on the right side? These are details of an eyewitness testimony. Consider the evidence of the resurrection. Do you believe that? Do you believe that Jesus has risen from the dead? And if you have, then it should invite an existential crisis in your life. Man, a few years ago actually, when I was working down in the medical center, I was working at a job at Baylor and I was in research compliance, and my job was all right. It wasn't the most meaningful, wasn't the least meaningful thing in the world, but I did like dressing up and kind of wearing skinny ties. I don't really get to do that anymore, but I used to wear skinny ties back in the day. Maybe I'll bust one out this year. But I was there one day, and it was like 2 years in of working at Baylor. And I'm working at Baylor, and I remember I hit my 2-year anniversary mark, and I called my dad, and I was talking to him, and he was like congratulating me over kind of what I had accomplished 2 years at the job, and we were talking, and I remember he said something I'll never forget. He said, give it 30 more years and call it a career. 2 weeks later, I quit. And I don't know what it was, but there's something about what he said. There was something about me as I looked forward into my life that just created this existential crisis about who I was and what I was meant to do and what God called me to do. And I remember after that phone call, I hung up and I just sat there staring off into space for like an hour, right? I'm just sitting there. And I realized that this is not what I think God had called me to do. And so I had no plan. I just quit my job and I just pressed into whatever God would have for me next. It was an incredible season of faith and of longing and of trying to find what God wanted me to do. And I believe that God has brought that in the season of my life as I pastor this church. But I wonder, for many of us, we have these existential moments, and when we think about our life and why we're here, and I think it's important for us as we look at this story and as we look at these women, that they experience this existential crisis, this moment in which everything they knew about life and death, everything they knew about defeat and victory, everything they knew about themselves was turned upside down. They thought Jesus was a good teacher, he was a good friend of theirs, but they had no idea. He even told them he was going to rise from the dead, and they could not comprehend it. And then what happens? He's not here, and their minds just explode. Look at verse 7. The angel says, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And this is important for two reasons. Think about these women. Not only are they experiencing an existential crisis because Jesus has risen and they expected to find him dead, next the angel tells them to go and tell. And again, this is a time in which women were not used as messengers, especially messengers of divine things. And so here you have these three women who had no idea what was going to happen. They are being commissioned to go tell the disciples. Go tell the disciples what Jesus has done and the fact that he has raised from the dead. And so on top of their existential crisis, now they are commissioned out to tell other people about the resurrection. This is their incredible story, and it's also our incredible story. The moment you know about the resurrection, the moment you believe the resurrection, you are commissioned to go tell of the resurrection. And many of us go through these life-altering moments, these turning points in our life. Maybe it's a change of job, maybe it's the death of a parent or a loved one, maybe it's an illness or some circumstances in your life, or their kids leaving home, and all of a sudden your life is different. It's never the same. This is what the resurrection is meant to do for you as well. It's meant for you to rethink everything about your life. Every assumption you have, everything that you believe, everything that you think about the future, about life and death, it's meant to be transformed by what Jesus has done. It could be a very disorienting moment, but through those moments, we find purpose and meaning in what God has called us to do. I also love how Peter is singled out. You notice that? Tell his disciples and Peter. Why is Peter singled out? There may be a lot of reasons for that, but I think Peter is singled out because if you remember, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. So I don't know where Peter is at in this moment, but I can tell you it's probably a pretty dark moment in his life. He has denied Jesus 3 times. He has watched Jesus be crucified. It feels like the end, and now he has to deal with this guilt for the rest of his life, this thing that he has done, the way that he has betrayed Jesus, and then all of a sudden this angel says, go tell the disciples, and oh yeah, go find Peter. And tell him Jesus is alive and he wants to meet you. I don't know if you're normal like me and don't like failure in your life or disappointments in your life, but I love that Peter is singled out because it reminds me that Jesus is about second chances. Jesus ain't mad that Peter denied him. Jesus isn't mad that Peter betrayed him, that Jesus walked away, that Jesus disobeyed. He isn't mad. He says, go find Peter and bring him because I want to be with him. Jesus loves you. He knows your failures. He knows the ways that maybe you've erred from his word this week, and yet he still invites you to come and go with him. And then I love lastly, he says, he's going before you to Galilee. There you're going to see him. And this is why Jesus is not present in this story. Jesus is not at the tomb. It's almost like Jesus, just like we saying, the buried body of Jesus opened up his eyes, and instead of chilling in the tomb, he bolts out of the tomb toward Galilee. What's that about? If you look at Galilee in the Gospel of Mark, Galilee is where Jesus does his greatest ministry. It's where Jesus recruits his disciples. It's where Jesus cleanses the lepers. It's where Jesus heals the paralyzed servant. It's where he rebukes fever and sickness, calms the storm, casts out demons, calls people to follow him, to become his followers for life. This is what Galilee represents in the book of Mark. And so it's almost like the angel is saying Jesus has no time to sit in the tomb and rejoice in the resurrection because he's back on mission. He's going to serve and love people. So if you feel like Jesus is distant in your life in this season, I would remind you that you find Jesus by going to where Jesus is. Where is Jesus? Loving and serving others. Jesus is not hanging out at the empty tomb. He's in Galilee doing work. And if we want to join Jesus, it's good for us to be alone and to have quiet time with him and to have time of prayer with him. But if you want to feel Jesus' power in your life, if you want to feel close to Jesus, the way that you do that is you go and love, serve people in his name. That's what you do. That's where you feel most alive. Using your gifts, using your talents, using your power, creativity, your energy to love and serve people, that is where you will find Jesus, because Jesus is found in Galilee. It's almost like at the end of the book of Mark, Mark invites us to stand with these women, and he invites us to go and serve as Jesus goes and serve. And this is especially a good reminder for us as we enter into a Christmas season in which we will be very busy, in which we will have so many Christmas parties and all these things to do and work to do and family get-togethers, to remind us that if you want to feel Jesus and if you don't want the season to pass you by, go love and serve. And I promise you it will be meaningful and will fulfill you in your life. As we draw to a close, I want to invite you to look at the last verse in our message this morning, verse 8. It says, "And then they went out of the tomb and they fled, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And if you look at the Greek, actually, it's pretty interesting. This word trembling in the Greek is actually the word we use for trauma. So this traumatic event has happened. And then you look and it says they were astonished. And this word for astonishment in the Greek is actually the root word for the word that we use for ecstasy, for extreme joy. And so these women flee out of the tomb, and they've had this traumatic experience, but they also have the deepest joy that they have ever known. They encountered God, and they responded with the deepest emotions possible. I want you to picture with me, if Mark were a movie, this is what Mark would be like. At the end of Mark's movie, instead of a slow frame where it's kind of pulling out and going toward the sky, that's not the way Mark ends his movie. Mark ends his movie with these women launching out of the tomb. And imagine they're launching out and then the movie just freeze frames. It just stops right there. And on your face, you see fear mixed with joy, mixed with excitement. All these emotions that are so deep within them, they are fleeing out and they're almost catapulting out of the tomb toward the world. That's how Mark would end. The end. I think Mark concludes his gospel not with the nice reunion of Peter and Jesus like in the other gospels. He doesn't end with a grand commissioning or him appearing to the disciples. He doesn't end like that, because he wants to highlight what the resurrection is meant to do in our hearts. It is scary, but also deeply joyful. Look what Mark Dever says. Mark Dever says, "No one who ever encounters the living Christ will ever respond with casual worship." Mark will not let us respond casually to the resurrection. Because in the resurrection, Jesus wins, death loses. And we are not to live casually in response to that reality. I almost entitled my sermon this morning, "Easter is an existential crisis," because it's meant to be. It's meant to challenge you. It's meant to call you to more, to believe again. It does not let us sit in our pessimism and our cynicism. It does not let us sit in our disappointment, but it calls us to go beyond those things, to where Jesus is going, into Galilee. Mark does not end his book by promising us a life free from worry or fear or uncertainty. It's a book of possibilities, of new horizons, of faith, of hope in life. We cannot respond to the resurrection with casual worship. I'll share one more story. In high school, there was this guy. He was not really my friend, but he went to the youth group that I went to. And I also saw him at school. And one night at youth group, I watched him during the worship. And I was a follower of Jesus at the time, but I was kind of in the back with my friends, kind of singing. And this dude, I will never forget, this dude walks out into the aisle during the worship and just lays flat on the ground in the aisle. I'm talking about his face was like on the carpet that probably had never been vacuumed in its life, right? He is face down, hands forward in prostrate worship of Jesus. And after that moment, I began to watch him. I watched him at school. He was a little bit older than me, but I began to watch him at school, and I noticed, man, that he wasn't weird or anything, but he was the guy who talked about Jesus. He was the guy who brought his Bible. He was the guy who was nice to everyone. I began to look at his life, and I began to think, man, this dude takes Jesus seriously. As you evaluate and look at your life, Jesus calls you to more. You can't look at the resurrection and respond casually. You have to respond with everything, the deepest emotions possible. It's a human story, but it's also a divine story of God come back to life, and it is the center of everything we do, teach, and believe. Let's pray.